Okay, well, welcome everyone. God bless you all. It's a pleasure to be here as we continue working through Exodus. And tonight we'll be in chapter 22. But last week, just a brief review, was pretty intense uh, week last week. We talked about the death penalty, a controversial issue, but it's not controversial to God. He's very clear on what he thinks is right on the subject. And when you think about it, when these types of things are done, it makes for a safer society. If people know what consequences are, then they're less likely to do the things that they don't care for the consequences. And we learned about that. And murder was one of them, which is premeditated. It wasn't like manslaughter or accidental. It was when you actually chose to kill someone. And then that person would have to be put to death because it shows the value of human life. It's life for life. One of the things in Christianity that has caused a problem is the King James Version. For years, everybody's read it. One of the commandments was, "Thou shalt not kill." And that was taken to be in general. And so they said it was sinful to kill somebody for murder or any other reason. So the newer translations have that accurately um, translated, "Thou shalt not murder." Now, there are times when people have to kill. We talk about wars, certain wars in self-defense, and that's another subject. So we went over that, and we talked about the things in the Old Testament in regarding how the law is righteous when it's used righteously, and certain laws are no longer effective, like the sacrificial the laws that were there and circumcision, other things like that aren't in effect, but God makes it clear when that is. And if he doesn't put something out of effect, then it still is. So it's been God's plan to destroy wickedness, and eventually he's going to go to great lengths to do that in the age to come. If you read in Revelation 20, he's going to take out all the evil people in just a few seconds. And even in the Battle of Armageddon, which we will be a part of, then we also see the destruction of the evil, and we'll be a part of that. So we went into that in detail, with capital punishment being also for kidnapping, and that was also one that punishment was required. And then we went into things like fist fights, and which is an interesting thing that God has wants to bring up. Men fighting. If one injures another, but he recovers enough to walk outside again, the offender only has to pay for lost time. So this is similar to some of the laws. When you're out of work, you have to pay these kinds of damages. And then we talked about if a woman gets involved and she's pregnant and the baby is stillborn or premature because of it, there's laws about that. God goes into a lot of detail. And the interesting thing is then if a man digs a pit out in the field and somebody's ox falls in it, well, that person who digged the pit, he's got to pay if that ox dies. So we have, the thing is we take the logic that God put in the Old Testament and we make more modern laws. And like we talked about the idea of a swimming pool, which is a pit full of water. Well, today's laws require you to have a fence around it to keep people from falling in. So we can take these, and of course, we talked about what the definition of a parapet is. We haven't got to that one yet, so I'll save that for later. But you all know what a parapet is. And God had certain laws that would protect people, and they were fair and they're just. And so we talked about that ordinances are usually more specific, the nuts and bolts, where commandments have a tendency, even though they're fairly specific, the ordinances get into a lot of these little details, uh, which are really very interesting. So tonight, if you'll take your app or whatever you're looking at, we're going to go into Exodus 22, verse 1. We're using the REV and things from the commentary. If you have a different version, that's fine. The words might be just a little bit different, but that's okay. You'll still be able to follow along here. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me make sure I got what I want up first, and I don't. So I'll fix that real quick. Okay, and now I'm going to share, and we've had some good success with sharing lately. Let's see if we do tonight. Okay, there we go. And it'll take just a moment for this to pop up. Let's see here. Hang on just a minute, guys. I don't see it. It's not giving me the option. Oh, okay. Here we go. There we go. For some reason it dropped one out here. So I'm going to bring it back up. Bear with me a minute. All right, that's what I want to see. Now I'm going to share. And yeah, this works. Jim, is it sharing?
It's starting, but we're
It's
getting the time wheel.
okay. It's just a little slow.
It must be all the high altitude.
Yeah, that's right. I'm up here above the clouds, as Adrian said this morning. It's still building, isn't it?
Yeah. Wow.
I had some trouble with people's voices tonight. Did you all hear kind of lags in voices? Maybe it's just on my end.
I didn't hear any.
Okay, here
I
we go.
did. I did a little bit.
You did a little bit. Now you're seeing it?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Good. No squares.
Yeah.
All righty, good. No gray squares. All right. Thanks for John's advice on that. Gave me some tips on how to get rid of them. All right. Exodus chapter 22, verse 1. We're getting into more ordinances. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he must pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. How's that? That's kind of unheard of, right? How come? So we're going to kind of unpack this and we're going to see a pattern. If you steal something, it's not enough just to replace what you stole. God thinks there should be consequences. In our society, that's a novel idea in some places. And the consequences should be measured and reasonable to fit the crime. So we're going to take a close look here at verse 1 and unpack it. And it's going to be very interesting. So you guys have probably caught, how come 5 oxen for an ox, but when you get to sheep, it's only 4 sheep? Okay, why would he do that? Uh, you know, and it's kind of very interesting because if you steal a sheep and kill it or sell it, you only have to pay back 4 instead of 5. Well, this is God's thinking. If you steal something more valuable, you're required to pay more. And that kind of makes sense. Now let's talk about this. Now, even in today's economy, an ox is more valuable than a sheep. Now, today, an ox would be similar to cattle. Like a cow or a bull or a steer. Everybody, I think, knows who's been around a farm, knows that a cow or a steer is going to worth far more than a sheep. So God takes these crimes seriously. And an ox does, but here there's something more about an ox. An ox does more than just provide meat and milk. If it's a cow ox, I don't know how they differentiate, but they're often to use as work animals. They'll pull a wagon. Some of you who are Santa Fe trail buffs like me have seen oxen pull these wagons across the country. Now, if you read up on them, they're a lot cheaper than mules. And the nice thing was that at the end of the trip, they could be slaughtered for food. They're only good for about a one-way trip, and they were worn out and not good to bring them back. But they were like cattle, but they were used for work. And so they had to be trained. And you've heard about you kick against the stick, the prow, because people would train their oxen to follow a row. And when the oxen didn't like it, you've heard the description, Israel was stiff-necked. Well, what happened, the ox, if they didn't like what they wanted, they get their neck all stiff, tighten those muscles. And then the guy had this prod, which would be a long stick with a kind of pointy end. Sometimes if he had metal, he put on and he'd poke it and get him to go back in the right way. And eventually it's hard for you to kick against the pricks, I think is in the King James, referring to the Apostle Paul when he was called, because he didn't want to do the straight and narrow the way the Lord wanted him to do. So we get a lot of stuff out of this oxen. We talk about yoke, we talk about stiff-necked, but the point is, in this verse, what we're talking about is they were trained animals. They were valuable not just for food, but they were valuable because of work. So therefore, if you stole an ox and you killed it or sold it, you had to pay back 5. Where sheep, they weren't trained. They weren't trained to do that stuff. They provided meat and wool and milk. And so if you stole one, you had to give back 4. Now that's a pretty serious consequence. So a person knows that if they steal a sheep and they get caught, they don't just give the sheep back. They have to pay 4. Now, we're going to find a little caveat here and we'll see, but you got to read the word closely and you'll catch this really quick. In the next few verses, I'll point this out. Now we're going to talk about thieves. Now, a thief, before I move on, what happens if the guy can't come up with 5 oxen if he steals an ox and kills it or sells it? What happens if a guy can't come up with 4 more sheep if he steals or sells or kills one of these sheep? And he can't come up with the money.
He becomes a slave?
That's right, 6 years. 6 years a slave. That was the consequence if you did something like this and you couldn't pay. He was 6 years a slave and he was released on the 7th year, remember? And that stuck. Now, in case if the guy really liked his living environment, and because a lot of times these slaves, they were in good homes. They were with people that loved God and tried to do the right thing. And sometimes, hey, I like staying here. I'm not very good with my money. And so this guy is, and I got food, water, shelter, clothing, people who I like to be around. I think I'll just keep it up the rest of my life. And then they could go down to the judge and everybody agrees. The master agrees. The judge says, this is a good thing. And next thing you know, they put an awl through his earlobe and he's got a big hole there, which signifies that now he is a slave or a servant for life. And the only thing that releases him from that servitude is the death of his master or a jubilee, an Israeli jubilee year. Then he would be released. So that would be how it works. So you got to be prepared. So they all knew this. Once these laws were given and someone intentionally went out, well, I'm going to go out and butcher this oxen over here. He knew he was going to have to pay back 5. And he knew that if he didn't have the 5, he's going to be a servant for 6 years. That's kind of a deterrent, wouldn't you say? See, that's what God wants. He's hard on the criminal and he's very kind and loving to the person who has been victimized. So let's go on to verse 2. If the thief is found in the act of breaking in, we're on another subject now. We're talking about home invasion. So if the thief is found in the act of breaking in and this thief is struck so that he dies, there will be no guilt for bloodshed incurred. It's self-defense. So someone breaks into the house, and you remember, we're talking about biblical times. They did not have light bulbs. They mostly used these lamps that had an oil of it. Oftentimes it could be animal fat or olive oil, some kind of flammable oil, and they would be dim. So if they had a light on during the night, you could hardly see. So you couldn't tell if the guy who broke in had a bat, a club, or some type of a knife. You didn't know. And so God says, if you kill him and he dies, you're okay. No problem. There's no punishment for you. But let's look at the next verse. If the sun has risen, that means you'll be able to see him. There will be guilt for bloodshed. A thief is to make restitution. Now, so if you kill a guy and you shouldn't have, because he wasn't armed and it's in broad daylight and he wants to run off, then, that's another story. And that makes sense. But at night, you don't know. So if somebody's in your house and they shouldn't be, it's okay. But if the sun's up and you can see what's going on, you gotta make a good decision. Now, a thief is to make restitution. yes, restitution. If he has nothing, here we go, then he has to be sold into that slavery because of his theft and he can't pay it back. Now, verse 6 or 4. If what was stolen is found, okay, now we're going to change subjects. Now, if you remember in verse 1, if he steals an ox or sheep and kills it or sells it, so it's gone, he sold it's over in Timbuktu. We don't know where that ox is. Now we got a different situation. Now, if what was stolen is found, they found the ox and it's alive, whether it's an ox, donkey, or sheep, guess what? He doesn't have to pay back 5 oxen or 4 sheep. He just doubles it. The ox goes to the owner, and then he has to come up with a second one. So that's his restitution for all the trouble that he put through this first person who stole it from. Okay. Sounds pretty logical. I think it makes sense to me. Now let's move on to verse 7 or 5. Now we're going to talk about crop protection. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or a vineyard and lets animals loose, and it grazes in another man's field, he is to make restitution from the best of his own field and from the best of his own vineyards. We have 2 situations here. A man who grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard, or lets his animals loose and it grazes in another man's field. So sometimes we have an intentional, like this first guy, he just lets them go, And the second guy, it looks more like it could be in an accident. They got loose and it grazes into another man. So he has to make restitution. So he eats the grain, he eats the crop. They don't say, well, that's okay, I'm sorry. He has to pay it back, not just from what's left over of his crop, but he has to give him the best of his crops or his vineyard. And this, you see, this is quite a deterrent. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So, and they didn't have police back then. And so if something like this happened, you were the law enforcement. If you lost an ox, that means you're going out looking for it, and it could take a lot of time. And if you were in the situation, even with the grain being eaten by the cattle, you still got to go to the judge and you got to make a determination, and that takes time. So that's why God says, well, to cover some of that, the consequences, you got to pay him from the best of yours. And that's how it goes. And it makes sense. They didn't have police. They had to do all this work on their own, have their families help them, went to a lot of trouble. And so by the time Jesus, you probably know, and because we know about this from the birth story of Jesus, people often put their cattle and livestock in their homes. They would have a room that was a little bit lower. The floor would be a little bit lower. So any drainage that would occur needed from the livestock, it would drain out, and they would bring their cow or their donkey into the house. They would have maybe 1 or 2, and that's why there would be a manger in the house, and they would keep an eye on them, because it's a lot easier to prevent someone from stealing something than just to haphazardly let it happen. Then you have to go find it, and you have to go through all this other stuff to make things right. So that's why they spent more time to keep things safe. Okay, next verse. Okay, laws about personal property. We're in verse 7. So let's go to verse 7. And it says, if a man gives his neighbor money or goods for safekeeping, okay, so can you take care of my ox? I'm going to go down to Texas here for a few weeks, or whatever they want to do. I'm going to go up north in Israel and enjoy the snow, or south and buy some dates, whatever. And you gave money to your neighbor, or, goods, and it was stolen out of this neighbor's house. If the thief is found, guess what? He pays double, right? He doesn't get away with just giving back what he stole. He pays double. If the thief is not found, okay, let's think about this. You gave your neighbor this stuff, and all of a sudden now it's gone. And the owner of the house must come near to the judges to see if he has put his hand on the neighbor's property. So what happened to the stuff I gave you? Did you keep it or steal it? So they have to make a judgment on that. For every matter of transgression, whether it's ox or donkey, for sheep or for clothing or any kind of loss, about which one can say, this is mine. Okay, you got two people going for the same thing. That's my ox. I recognize it. No, that's my ox. The claim of both parties is to come before the judges. And so the judges look it over, they hear what's going on, the judges decides whose it is. And then the guy whose ox it wasn't, guess what? He has to pay double. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal for safekeeping, and it dies, or is injured, or is carried away without anyone seeing it, that's the condition, Oh, your ox died. I don't know what happened. Nobody knows. Well, verse 11, the oath is made before Yahweh to be between them both, that he has not laid his hands on his neighbor's property. And if the owner accepts it, yeah, I know you didn't kill my ox, it wasn't anything your fault, then he won't make restitution. But if it was stolen, stolen from him, then that owner, whoops, you stole it, he's got to make restitution. And guess what that is? It's always double. Okay, now we're into verse 13. If it is torn, torn by wild animals, and this happens here in New Mexico and in Colorado, they're reintroducing the Mexican gray wolf to the disdain of many ranchers in Colorado, because these wolves have a tendency to kill their cattle, young cattle and sheep and other things like that. And so what is ending up is the government, if you get your cattle killed by a wolf, they're paying you for that animal. So far, they paid out $500,000 for that particular plan to get those wolves back. But anyhow, sometimes that happens in the wild, even in our country and other places. Wild animals will come and kill it. Now, back in Israel, they still had lions and they had bears, and so it would not be uncommon. So if it is torn by wild animals, he must bring it in for evidence. Let's take a look at this. And he will not have to make restitution. So he's not responsible for wild animals. Verse 14, if a man borrows anything of his neighbor's and is injured or dies, its owner not being with it. Okay, think about this. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, okay, can I borrow your ox over here? I got to do some plowing and we need a couple of them because it's a big deal and we got a lot of work. Okay, I'll loan it to you. Now the owner, he can come over and just watch, keep an eye on it. So if this animal is injured or dies and its owner doesn't see what happened, the guy must make restitution. So you see the situation, the ox is out there, the owner is not there with it, he must make restitution. Now, if the owner is with it, he will not make restitution. So if the owner who loaned it to him is actually there and he sees the animal and the animal's working along and something happens, it breaks its leg or it drops dead, whatever, if the owner is there, he doesn't have to make restitution because it's proof that there was no wrongdoing by the person who borrowed it. It just happened. The other way, there is that deal where he's going to have to make restitution. Now, if it's rented, then the loss is covered by the rent. So if you said, hey, I'll pay you so much to loan me your ox, and he pays the rent, and then if the ox is injured or dies, then the rental money is covered by the rent. So that's how you dealt with that situation. Now, laws about seduction. Let's go on to verse 16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, let me catch up here with my notes. So what we would call this is we call this premarital sex. And they're not engaged. And this man seduces this young woman and lies with her. He must pay. So he's caught and he's going to have to pay that virgin's dad, the bride price for his wife. And from what we can tell, customarily, that was 40 shekels of silver. And so that was the deal. So I'm sorry, 50 shekels. And that money would be paid to the father. Now, what's the father? Let's look at, now later on that's changed. And let's take a quick look at Deuteronomy here. Flip right over Deuteronomy. There's an addition here. If the man who lays with her must give the girl's father, here it is, 50 shekels, it's right there, of silver, she must be his wife. So there's the condition. They get married because he has humbled her. He may not divorce her all of his days. So there's another stipulation. No divorce was allowed in those situations. So God tried to make this difficult for people to really think twice before they did something that they shouldn't be doing. So there's money involved, and there's also that other can't divorce her involved. But then here's one other little caveat here in verse 17. If the father refuses to give her to him, saying, no, I don't think I like you, I'm not going to let my daughter marry you, then the guy still gets to pay the bride price of $50, but he doesn't get the girl. And that's how God looks at it, and that's the deal on that. Verse 18, now we're going to go back into some capital offenses. Verse 18 says, you must not allow a sorceress to live. Now, sorceresses would use supernatural forces to control things in the natural world. And you've probably seen it. Some of them are supposed to act like they're trying to do good. At other times they do evil, but with God, there's no difference. This kind of magic was exert control over the will of God. And the sources for these controls were demonic. And when you get demons involved, things are going to end badly. Sometimes they act like they're doing a good thing, but that's only a counterfeit. So the same punishment would apply to males. Now, it says sorceresses because you saw more women, female, because men had more options for work. Women had fewer options. And so that's what they did. They would get into this kind of situation that was more common. And these people had to be put to death because they were in close involvement with demons, and the demons are the enemies of God, and they're hurtful to people in creation. And there's no such thing as good witch or witchcraft. Demons sometimes portrayed themselves as angels, as light and helpful, but there always was going to be a bad end. And we also have to consider, too, that people in the Old Testament didn't have access to the gift of Holy Spirit except with a few, which we know about. That Spirit would be laid on people like on David and on King Saul and the prophets and others. The general public, they didn't have access to it. So they had to deal with spiritual wickedness in a very physical way. Now, today, we wrestle against evil with spiritual weapons. But let's take a look here in 1 Samuel 28, verse 3. We're going to see this situation here in verse 3 of 28. Now, Samuel was dead. Now, Samuel was the prophet who anointed King Saul. And all of Israel lamented for him, because you guys will remember he was a great prophet. And they buried him in Ramoth, in his own city. And Saul had removed from the land all those who inquired of spirits or had familiar spirits. So it's kind of, Saul took care of them. He did what God said. And that's what he did. But then let's scroll down here a little bit. It's kind of ironic. In verse 7, so later on, then Saul said to his servants, seek me out a woman who possesses a familiar spirit. He wants one of these sorceresses, that I may go to her and inquire of her. The servant said to him, well, behold, there's a woman who has a familiar spirit in Endor. So Paul disguises himself and put on different clothing, and he and two men with him, and they came to the woman at night. And he said, please divine for me by the familiar spirit and bring up for me the one that I say to you. And in verse 9, and the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he's removed from the land those who inquire of spirits or have familiar spirits. So why do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? And then Saul swore to her by Yahweh, saying, as Yahweh lives, no punishment will happen to you for this thing. So he's kind of a hypocrite here. He gets rid of them, but when he wants one, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Verse 11, the woman said, whom do you want me to bring up for you? And he says, bring up Samuel for me. And the woman saw, and when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out in a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The lights come on. And she realized it's King Saul. So we have kind of a hypocritical situation, but that's what happened. And it's right there. It's kind of an ironic twist. In Exodus 22:19, let's go back to that. In 22:19, okay, here we go into the next thing that is a capital punishment. Whoever has sex with an animal must be put to death. Yes, death. Now, we call that bestiality, and it's forbidden for God. It's forbidden by God. And it was apparently common because this is not the only time brings it up. And we know from other cultures around Israel, sex with animals was ritualized and even connected to magic and pagan worship. The Hittites even had laws saying you couldn't have sex with these group of animals, but you could with others. And a lot of this was tied in with pagan worship in the temples. And as you know, sex was a big deal in certain pagan temples, not only with humans, other humans, but with animals. And so it was a form of worship, and it could be done inside temples or anywhere. Now, they would have the sex because they believed that their God would make the land fertile and abundant harvest. So in Leviticus, God calls this a perversion, a disgrace. It's a perversion of God's created order. And if you recall, when God created animals back in the beginning, and Adam was naming them, he was still considered alone and needed another human being. So it was set up that way from the beginning. Verse 20, he who sacrifices to gods except to Yahweh only is to be devoted to destruction. And that's just another way to say executed. And so this normally refers to other gods like pagan gods, but it could also refer to people, even though in Israel they didn't worship or sacrifice to people, but other countries did, like the Romans did, and others would actually sacrifice to people. So now we're going to move into protecting the vulnerable here in this next section. Verse 21, you must not wrong a foreigner, nor are you to mistreat him, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Remember that? Now, a foreigner could be just a sojourner, somebody passing through. And the Israelites who were oppressed foreigners knew from experience how that felt, and they knew it was wrong and that godly people do not oppress others. So God makes that clear. You're not to do that. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. And here God is concerned about the widow and the fatherless child and doesn't want them mistreated, which would be often the case because widows would not have a husband to protect them. And this was a very dangerous, in a lot of ways, it would be dangerous. They could be, first of all, they wouldn't have his protection to protect her from any mistreatment, and he would not have his strength to work and bring in income. So it was very difficult for a widow and a fatherless child. It was difficult. A woman was left on her own without a husband had to deal with these things. And orphans or fatherless child, they were normally helpless. and had no one to support them. And this just shows the mercy and love that God has for people. Verse 23, if you mistreat them, then they will cry out to me, and I will hear their cry. And my wrath will grow hot, and I will kill you with a sword. So your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless. So God has very strong feelings about this. Now, it doesn't mean he's literally going to come down with a sword and kill him, but the guy is going to die. He's going to get killed some way or another, is from what this says, because God's wrath will grow hot. So that's a stern warning. Verse 25, we'll get into loans. Now, if you lend money to any person with you who is poor, you must not be to him a creditor, nor are you to charge him interest. So you can loan him some money and he can pay it back, but you're not going to demand payment by a certain time. And this, that, and the other, and you're not going to charge, even though he needs to pay you back, you're not going to charge him any type of interest. Now, for instance, say, okay, you loan this poor person this money. It says in verse 26, and you take as collateral your neighbor's cloak. And oftentimes that's all they had. They had no shelter. You must return it to him before the sun goes down. So that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his skin. In what would he sleep? So this is very compassionate of God. It's okay for you to take the cloak for collateral, but when it's in the evening, he needs it or he'll be cold. And what would he sleep? When he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. Now, so what you do is when he gets up, he gives the cloak back to you. And so that's how God had it done. Verse 28, you must not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. So God's very clear too about doing this. He doesn't want him to be himself, God, to be treated that way. And he doesn't want others that he puts in order as rulers to be treated. We're talking about God and a representative of God. God forbids reviling him and reviling his agents, such as judges. And this word revile, it can mean more than just a curse, even though that's how it's translated here in the REV. It has a larger range, and it could be translated as being disrespectful or being treated contemptuously. So it's serious to God. Verse 29, you must not delay offering the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. You're to get. So when you brought in these offerings, these goods to the priests and the others, that the Levites and the priests, it was important that you bring it quickly. Because as you know, if you're dealing with grapes, grape juice spoils pretty quick. And other types of harvest, if the grains are not handled properly, they can get moldy, or they can get fouled with rodents pretty quickly. So it has to be brought to them quickly. That's what God commands. Also, if you are to give the firstborn, you are to give the firstborn sons to me. And we talked about that earlier. And in one time it just said the firstborn, and then he made it really clear that it was going to be the firstborn males. And then in Numbers 8, we'll take a quick look at that. Numbers 8, verse 16, because they are wholly given to me from among the children of Israel, I have taken them. We're talking about the Levites now. I have taken them for myself instead of the firstborn of all the children of Israel, all who opened the womb. So the Levites, here we can see now I have taken the Levites in verse 18 instead of all the firstborn of the children of Israel. So he makes that change. Okay, back to Exodus chapter 22, verse 30. You are to do the same with your cattle and your sheep. 7 days it will be with its mother, then the 8th day you'll give it to me. So again, we're talking about the firstborn male. The first male lamb was given. and you're to bring it on the 8th. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be sacrificed on the 8th, but it was given to me, given to the priests, the Levites, and they would hold it for the proper time. And God is all about being gracious and doing things the right way, but reasonable. Normally, if we had Sue on the line, she could confirm this, but normally the lambing period in the spring would take several weeks, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks. So you're having these lambs being born, and the male ones. So it really isn't practical for the shepherd to, okay, here's a firstborn male. It's now 8 days old. I got to run him off to the Levite. It's thought that they're probably take the time through the whole lambing season and then bring them in all at once. It would be very practical. There's no documentation on that, but that's written in the RED, and I checked it out through other sources, and it seems like it's a practical version because you're going to think about that. Anybody who raises sheep, if Sue were here, she'd probably say, wow, that would be a chore. But they have ways of dealing it. And then verse 31, you are to be a holy people to me. That's a separated people. You can't do things like everybody else does. Therefore, you are not to eat any flesh that's torn in the field. Now, if something, say, for instance, your ox or your one of your sheep were killed by something, wolves, if they had them there, I'm not sure. And the animal is left there. And you think, well, I guess we'll just bring it in. Well, then it hasn't been properly butchered. And there's ways that things have to be butchered for them to stay clean. You have to deal with entrails. You got to deal with the wool, the hide and the hair touching the meat. There's a lot of things. God said, no, don't eat it. It could make you sick anyhow. You're not going to do that. So you throw it to the dogs. Now, back then they had dogs that prowled around. They were scavengers. They're not like today where people will have them as pets. They just kind of were there, and it was rare that they ever had pets. I think the Romans had some dog pets, but normally they were just kind of semi-wild, and they walked around and moved around. And if there's anything dead, they cleaned it up, kind of like the vultures and the other birds of the air. So that's what they did. God says, just throw it to the dogs. And so these are all interesting ordinances. I think it's pretty cool how God set things up. I think it's pretty interesting. And let me stop sharing here. All these different things and the right ways of doing stuff. And you can see how much thought and love got put into it. And we're talking about things that maybe don't apply to us, but they could, like an oxen. Well, maybe we have a cow and that kind of things. But in today, what happens is people get thrown into prison. There's hardly ever any kind of restitution. Somebody does something, they steal from you and they can't find the money. Sorry, Now they'll put that person in prison and maybe he'll make license plates or office furniture and he'll make money for the prison. But do they send you a monthly stipend? No. Okay, the guy might get fined for what he did. Do they give you the money for the fine? No. Our society does not promote restitution. God does in a big time way. Not does you just give back what you stole, or if you stole 1,000, you give 1,000, you give 2,000 back. And you see, the capital punishment idea and the restitution idea really was a huge deterrent. You think, well, it's so severe. I bet you if these were put into practice, crime would just fade away. No one wants to risk capital punishment. Capital punishment back then was done the same day or within a few days. No 19 to 20 years on death row. And then if somebody lied to try to get you put to death, lied about it, and they found out you were lying, you get put to death. So perjury was rare, it just goes out the window. So the things that need to be done for, say, society is to apply these laws and do it quickly, because it says, and remember we read in Ecclesiastes, if it's not get quickly, people just go on and do evil because, In 20 years, what can happen in 20 years? I'll still be around. Oh, I steal this. Oh, I get caught. I got thrown into jail for a year, and they feed me. I got cable TV. I get my law degree, and I can work out at the gym. All that stuff. It's you wonder why we have so much crime in our society, but it's harsh. And I know when I first heard this stuff, it takes a little while to adjust, and it takes a little while to understand. Just got to think about it a little bit. And it really makes sense, because when people know what the consequences are, they're far less likely to kidnap somebody or to murder somebody or to steal something. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for your wisdom, your justice, and how you reveal that to us, and help us to put your ways of thinking on in our minds. So when we deal with things, or we have to be a judge, or we have to make a decision, or we have to help somebody figure out something, we think in terms like you do. And it's such a wonderful way to think. So help us in our thinking. And we are to be imitators of you as dear children, you say in your word. So thank you for this group tonight, the love you have for each of us, how you take such good care of us, for a sweet sleep tonight and a wonderful weekend. Thank you for the holidays coming up, Christmas next Thursday, and all the time. Hopefully we all get to spend some time with family and to do things that are a blessing. We pray for those people that have lost loved ones, that that just be with them and comfort them through this season. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.